So, what is counterpoint? What's the point? Oh, there's a point, and you're about to hear all about it. Feel free to follow along on our website, musicstudent101.com. Here are your hosts, Jeremy Burns and Matthew Scott Phillips.
So I know what's on everybody's mind right now.
The state of the universe as we know it, and the fact that we only understand about 3% of it?
No.
No?
Where is Mike Cunliffe, our normal announcer?
Oh, yeah. Where is that guy?
Well, normally I can get a hold of him, and don't be worried, he's okay.
Okay. Good.
Normally I can get a hold of him the week of, sometime, and he just comes right up the hill. He lives right down the street. Did you know this?
Yeah, that's great. We can go over there and hang out.
And it's funny, after I decided I wanted him as our announcer, after that he moved right down the street. As if he did it for us.
Fortuitous. We're going to believe that he did that for us.
Yeah.
We choose to believe that was solely to be.
Yeah, that's our story, and we're sticking by it. But, the only reason I'm taking the time to talk about him is because I think he deserves a little bit of due credit, having done such a fine job so far.
Indeed.
He and his lovely wife, Sarah, are part of the theater community here in Birmingham. And I couldn't get a hold of him for voiceovers because he was knee-deep in rehearsals. And when those theater kids rehearse, man, they rehearse.
Oh, yeah. Those guys are, theater people are serious.
Mm-hmm. So they're working on a play called Act of God, and that was, they're rehearsing Wednesday, Thursday. It's running Friday, Saturday, Sunday.
Wonderful.
And I'm sure going to try and see it, and if I can't, either way, I know it'll be a great show because I've seen them both act before, and they're very talented. So break a leg, guys, and Mike will catch you on the next one.
Yep, break a leg.
So who you did hear was a friend of mine named Jerry Chapman, also known as Jerome Chapman. That was his voiceover, and you've heard him before, whether you know it or not.
Really?
You've heard his guitar and a lot of our bumper music, actually. Often how it works, in fact, I'll put down a rhythm track that I think is okay, and then he'll come in and make it super cool by spicing it up with a melody of some kind. And you'll hear this kind of thing happen on the bumper music to our intro, our very first episode. It's called Another Bright Idea. He's playing the melody on that.
Oh, very nice.
Episode 4, Red Wire, Blue Wire, the intro to our first ear training episode.
Right, very
It's my
nice,
favorite
yeah.
because he does this insane kind of Phrygian solo thing towards the very end. He just goes wild.
Yeah, some good guitar work there.
Yeah. And
Obviously, which is why, we chose to use it.
Hell yeah. And then episode 7, where we did the one on odd time signatures, he did this kind of slide guitar over my piano, bass, and drums. That one's called Gone in 70 Seconds. He really, really made that one stand out.
I liked that one a lot.
So we have this great little community of creatives and artists that we kind of tend to pull from. And, we'll have little, hey, you want to come record something? Help me out, I'll help you out kind of thing.
Yeah, indeed, yeah.
But the talent is there.
We're very fortunate to have all of the people so close to us that we do.
Mm-hmm.
People around the nation and world don't necessarily think of Birmingham, Alabama as the thriving artistic community that I see it as sometimes. There's so much great stuff going on here. We're very fortunate.
I concur. Either way, we just wanted to give a shout out to our some of the people that help us out. And without further ado, I suppose we can get on to this episode.
Yes, let's do that.
Has anyone heard of the parallel fifth or the parallel octave? Or how evil it is and
how evil it is.
How horrible it is.
They'll throw you in composer jail for writing parallel fifths.
Well, that is all about voice leading.
Yes, it is.
What I guess we should just go ahead and get right into what is voice leading. That is our episode for the day.
It is. We're talking about voice leading, and voice leading is, in a word, the rules that govern how different voices within your musical texture, typically bass, tenor, alto, and soprano, how those voices move from one note to the next and move against each other to create parts. And that might sound like something you don't do if you're not a vocal composer or a classical music composer or something, but actually a lot of music is divisible into those 4 voices. So it affects all of us. And there are rules that have governed these things for centuries that are basically the culmination of people trying things that didn't work until we figured out what works.
So these conventions, though based on kind of early classical music, go beyond that, and people still try and honor them within all genres of Western music.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. When you get into popular music, they are not observed as strictly as they were in classical music leading up into the 19th century, and a lot of stuff falls apart in the 20th century. But even today, a basic knowledge of these rules can really help you write music. Even if you're writing, folk music, a basic knowledge of these rules can help you decide how you want to voice certain chords and how you want to play them, I think.
And right now, for our purposes, we're just mainly talking about. I guess for this episode, we're going to mainly focus on the SATB chorale, 4-part chorale.
Right. Yeah. And this is sort of our laboratory-like setting, the SATB chorale, in which you can learn the principles, then apply to everything from Bach fugues to everything else.
We haven't. I'm not sure if we've actually officially told everyone what SATB is. Should we just get a quick refresher?
Yeah, and
on that?
SATB being soprano, alto, tenor, bass. Typical 4-voice texture. Obviously, out there in the actual world, there's music that is 3-voice texture and music that is 5-voice texture. But for the sake of our sort of music theory laboratory, where we're going to learn basic concepts, we tend to stick with SATB, those 4 voices.
Well, that keeps it nice and simple for me for right now.
Yeah.
When I have to go back and notate these things to put on the website. Don't give me that 24-part.
There was they have Guinness Book of World Records sort of stuff with this. There was a Renaissance composer that got up to like 16 parts.
Yeah.
I think his name was Octaves. And I think he wrote at least one piece for like 16 parts or 19 parts or something like that.
Huh.
I'd have to go look that back up.
Back in the Renaissance.
Back in the Renaissance, yeah.
Oh, can we have a quick history on how these conventions came about, or should we do that after we kind of describe the conventions, do you think?
It's up to you.
Let's just go ahead and talk about when this all began. Who came up,
How did this happen?
How did this happen?
That's fascinating. No one person sort of just sat down and laid out all of these rules. These rules kind of evolved through convention. In the Middle Ages, everything is basically monophony, right? And so everybody's singing the same melody. Is what that means.
All unison, right?
All unison. I mean, you may be having different octaves, stuff like that, but same notes.
Yeah. Same pitch classes.
Same pitch classes. Yeah. Good use of the term.
Yes.
Some people have proposed that they would musicians would go to bars and hear people singing bar songs and be out of key and things like that, and it just evolved into through the course of the later Middle Ages. It evolved through these 5 stages of organum, in which eventually they're singing not only in octaves but in octaves and fifths, and then those octaves and fifths are then allowed to sort of move in contrary motion. So instead of both going up, they can sort of, one might go in the opposite direction, that kind of thing. And and then at some point we got the organum that a lot of us have probably studied, where one person just sings a really low note and other people sing on top of it,
like a drone kind of pedal.
Yeah, drone.
Should we define organum real quick for those of us?
Yeah, or organum was a Middle Ages musical compositional style created in the Notre Dame Cathedral in the latter Middle Ages, which the first few notes of a chant were sung in very long, drawn-out notes in the bottom voice, while an upper voice sang melodically over it.
Okay.
Go look up the composers Leonin and Perotin, who were the primary advocates of that style.
Very cool. Very cool. And
but
we're going to
anyway-
talk about that in our Middle Ages music
Yeah,
episode.
well,
Whenever we get that together.
Stay tuned for the
We will do some history, I swear to God.
Yes, we really will. But anyway, and it continues to evolve into what we consider the modal counterpoint of the Renaissance. What Palestrina did, and it did this because what they wanted to do, what they had wanted to do for a long time at that point, was have all of these voices maintain a certain sense of independence, so that you could listen to any of them, any soprano, alto, tenor, bass, or even before that happened, other voices, and hear them as an independent thing that could stand on its own.
Mm-hmm.
What happened when you didn't do that was you had sort of holes in your texture. You would reach a point in the music where it would just seem to drop out.
Ah, yes.
And it was like a bad audio
like
effect.
a thinning out kind of thing.
Yeah, like and of course, going to a thinner texture can be a good thing when you mean to, but when it just happens spontaneously, for no apparent reason, it kind of was bad. So they sort of discovered procedures that were in music, in the way the notes moved, that would create that giant hole. And they said, well, don't do that. And that was the beginning of the rules of counterpoint, and they were, by the time you get to Palestrina, these rules are pretty complex. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And then because he's doing really big stuff and to keep that falling out of texture from happening, he's got a lot of rules. And then when you move into Bach, these rules sort of become wrapped up in this new crazy thing called tonal harmony that everybody's talking about, right? And they become part of the rules of tonal harmony as well.
Right, but even before the idea of tonal harmony was established, these concepts were still being observed, correct?
Yes, they were. There were still voice leading rules. There were rules to, they called it counterpoint, how the notes moved against each other in the different ranges and melodies and things like that. It was called counterpoint, and the laws of counterpoint were strictly observed.
So would you say that one definition of counterpoint might be the combining of independent melodic lines to create a texture, or the textures that result from...
Yeah, sure.
Cool.
Yeah, the textures that result from the combination of melodic lines, or the rules that govern those combinations.
Oh, great. All right, so we spoke about the origin of these kind of norms, these voice-leading norms or conventions. Shall we discuss the norms themselves? Should we discuss...
Is this where we get to talk about the rules?
This is where we get to talk about the rules.
Right, where we get to talk about the rules. And I should probably say, just a PSA here, if you're taking music theory in college, you are painfully aware of these rules probably, or if not, you will be very soon. And a lot of people just don't understand why it matters that much.
And I was one of those.
Yeah.
Because there were times where I thought parallel fifths and octaves sounded kind of cool together.
There are times when there are. And we can we can get into those definitely. But there is a lot of emphasis placed on you doing theory exercises that don't break these rules, and it can be difficult for you to understand why, because you may think, well, I'm not a singer. Part of these rules, they evolved because certain things were hard to sing too. That was a part of it, especially back in the Renaissance when almost all music was vocal. But you may think, I'm not a singer, or I think this sounds fine. But keep in mind what it is you're trying to do if you're trying to write a piece of tonal harmony, which is what part of what you're learning to do in theory is how the rules of tonal harmony work, right? So it's not always about, does it sound fine? It's about, does it sound like the thing you were trying to make it sound like? And you're going to have real problems making it sound like tonal harmony if you're breaking a lot of these rules.
I'm going to ask you a question.
Okay.
Are we learning these rules so we can break them?
No.
Ah.
No, we're not. Everybody always says that. You have to learn the rules before you can, so that you can break them, right?
Mm-hmm. Or so that you understand what you're doing when you break them.
Yeah, you don't break them. It's like I said, Bach had a lifetime of genius and never really wrote parallel fifths. Even if you can find things that look like he did, when you look at it carefully, it becomes not necessarily true. Because what you're doing is not learning the rules so that you can break them. You're learning the rules and then learning the rules better and better so that you have this deeper understanding, and with that deeper understanding, you can do more complicated stuff. That's not breaking the rules. That's learning the rules better.
Expanding.
Right.
Expounding.
Yes.
Okay, so here I am. I'm a composer. I got my little feather pen in my hand. I got my staff paper. I got my inkwell. I got my candlelight.
I'm already high on opium.
I'm already high on opium. And I'm about to sit down and write a 4-part harmony, be it a chorale or be it a quartet.
Right.
So before I even write the first note, here are the conventions and the rules I need to have in mind.
Right.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and talk about the melodic line itself.
Okay.
And some tips for the actual melodic. For one melody, we're just going to focus on one melody right now.
Okay.
Let's say we're doing the actual melody of the song, the soprano part.
Okay, let's pretend we're doing the soprano part.
First off, maybe keep the rhythms kind of simple.
For now.
For now.
Obviously, like I said, when we start writing real music, simple melodies aren't always a good thing. You want to have sophisticated melodies. That's great. Remember that when we're studying these things in theory, this is kind of like a laboratory. We're studying the basic concepts. So you don't want to get super elaborate right now. You want to understand the concepts, and then you can apply those concepts to elaborate things. So yeah, keep it fairly simple.
Especially if we're trying to understand these rules early on.
Right. Yeah.
No sense in throwing a whole bunch of 30-second notes that we're going to have to sit there and count.
Right, yeah, because those things have their own rules that govern them, and, you got to start somewhere, right?
One rule at a time, right?
One rule at a time.
Okay, so let's keep the rhythm simple. Next up, each note in the melody should be a member of or belong to the chord that it is intended to harmonize with.
Yeah, again, for now.
Which to me sounded kind of funny because what comes first?
It's a chicken and an egg situation. Definitely.
So if I'm writing a piece where at one point 2 melodies harmonize on a G and a B, I could still write another melody and say, well, this is an E minor, and I could write another melody that says it's a G major.
Absolutely.
Right? So
absolutely. Be flexible in what you think your chord is. There was a time when composers weren't worried about chords. They were just worried about the notes being consonant together at the times when they were supposed to be consonant together, like on the downbeat or things. They didn't necessarily think in terms of chords. There was a theorist named Rameau that came along and said, well, these are actually chords that progress in a way. Be flexible about that.
Flexible, yes, but I wouldn't take that same G and B interval and decide to throw something crazy like a C sharp on top of it.
Not right now.
I might if it was a passing tone, but we're going to talk about passing tones.
We're going to talk about
on.
all of that stuff, yeah.
Okay, non-chord tones.
Non-chord tones, yeah.
But for right now, let's just keep that simple and move on, huh?
Yeah, for right now, let's learn the basic skeletons, and then we'll talk about other stuff.
But we're still concentrating on this one melody, and one other thing we're going to keep in mind is to keep the contour simple.
Keep the contour simple, yeah.
What is the contour of a melody?
The contour of the melody is its basic shape is in terms of direction. For example, an arching contour melody. It kind of went up to a peak and then came back down.
if you're looking at this on a music staff, it would kind of look like a hill.
Yeah, it would kind of look like a hill.
Or an
so we call
arch.
it an arch, yeah. And that's an upward arch. And of course, there's downward arching melodies. You know, I'm not keeping my rhythm simple, which is bad, but
Keeps it interesting for the listener.
Yeah, bear with me. There can be contours that undulate.
So that one kind of went up, down, and back.
Up, down, yeah, around what we will call changing tones. But I'm going to play that in quarter notes one good time, just for the sake of obeying my own rules.
Very rhythmically simple.
Very, yeah.
You followed the rule of the early tip, the early convention. Okay, so we kind of talked about a contour. Now this is also kind of included within the contour is the leaps versus steps.
Right. Yeah. So what we're saying, be careful about when we say keep the contour simple. It's sort of don't. Yeah. That kind of thing.
I was liking the first part of that, actually.
Yeah. I mean, again, laboratory-like. We're keeping it simple for now.
Yeah.
When we learn more, we can do whatever we want, There's ways to explain that. It's actually just a diatonic melody. It's going.
But what I heard within that was some larger leaps, I think, than some of the simpler melodies we were talking about.
Yeah, right.
So within this whole thing about leaps, I have 3 little things we should keep in mind.
Okay.
One is to avoid augmented intervals,
yes,
sevenths, and intervals that exceed the perfect fifth.
Right. Yeah. Avoiding augmented intervals, we want to avoid those because at this point we don't have good ways to harmonize those. In a lot of voice leading examples, those are considered dissonant intervals.
Mm-hmm.
For example, the augmented fourth. There will be a time when that is fine. But for the sake of learning simple things first, let's not worry about augmented intervals until we know how to deal with them. We don't really know how to deal with those yet.
Just for the time being, let's try to avoid them.
Yes,
if we can.
Sevenths. Sevenths, it can be kind of the same thing. Let's just worry about those later. Sevenths are a leap greater than a fifth, and that's really the biggest thing that's important. The reason you want to avoid leaps that are greater than a fifth, is remember that we're composing in 4 voices.
Right.
And when you exceed as long as I'm within a fifth, that's totally one voice, right? And presumably some other voice would be down here, or whatever. When you get beyond that, it starts to be sort of questionable whether you're staying in the same voice or jumping between 2 of them. When I do that, that might be 2 voices there, and which would then, go, or whatever. But, so am I playing in 2 voices when I do that, or is this just supposed to be your one voice? It sort of, it messes with the sort of integrity of your texture, where you think, well, sounds like you're jumping between 2 voices here.
And I will say it can also, another possible result of not following this convention is that you can push one of your singers into outer space if you're not careful, right?
Definitely. If you're writing vocal music, yeah, you'll push your singers into outer space, and you can end up giving them difficult intervals to sing. Mm-hmm. If you're giving them, if you write a lot of augmented intervals or sevenths for vocal music, a lot of vocalists will find those more difficult to sing. Mm-hmm. It's not that they can't do it if they're professionals, but you are writing more challenging stuff.
Yeah, and also I like when I play with Jasper Cole, my Irish band. There's actually 4-part harmonies that go on from time to time.
Right.
And some of our favorite melodies are actually melodies that involve a few good leaps. There's a really passionate part that goes way high.
Oh, totally.
Well, if the line is tenor in the first place from the melody, and I'm trying to harmonize and follow in parallel motion a third above that harmony, and he goes up to like a high A. Well, damned if I can hit that high C. Maybe I can on a good day, but it's also, you have to kind of keep your if you want to have a good kind of texture, a tight texture.
Yeah.
You kind of have to think about those things.
You kind of have to think about where you are in relation to the other people who are singing.
Yeah.
And that can apply to, instrumental music as well,
Because we have to keep in mind the ranges of whatever instruments we're composing for.
Yeah, if you're writing for string quartet, you have to keep in mind where the second violin is in relation to the first violin and vice versa. Those jumps, that's a thing called a compound line or a compound melody. And yeah, they're great. Bach did them all the time. Right? Where he's got that's not even a leap larger than a fifth, but those are great, and they are very appealing and engaging and beautiful melodies. They're just melodies that occupy two voices, right? And right now, we're trying to deal with one voice. Mm-hmm. It's a laboratory-like setting.
Yeah. Well, within the rules about the melodic line, still sticking with leaps, so I have one more thing here. Actually, two more things here. Intervals that are greater than a perfect fourth should be approached and left in the opposite direction.
Yeah. So this is, again, in part designed to preserve the integrity of the melodic line. If I break that rule, if I go above a fourth, if I go a perfect fifth, and then follow that with something and just again going up, so now I've got integrity issues. Is this one voice or is this two voices? So again, that's just designed to preserve the integrity. If I follow the rule and go down after that, that's easier to hear that, because I'm kind of going back towards that original note, and definitely don't go two leaps in the same direction, because now you're just
outlining a triad.
Yeah, and the one time when you can leap twice in the same direction is when you're outlining a triad.
I have that as the next rule, that consecutive leaps in the same direction should probably outline a triad. Yeah, you can do that all day. Very nice. I like that. And you've heard that a lot. We've heard that a lot. So we know that's obviously an accepted thing to do.
But, that sounds like three voices to me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 4 chord.
Right.
5/7. So, with all of those notes, they are moving in a certain way. We'll get into that, though.
That's cool. Well, before we move on from the melodic line, I just have one more thing that I'm going to ask you about.
Absolutely.
And what do you think about the idea that there should be, the melodic line should probably include a few tendency tones? And what are tendency tones?
Tendency tones, and we've probably touched on this a little bit in past podcasts.
Right.
Tendency tones are tones that within tonal harmony want to move in a certain way and want to land on another tone. So, for example, if I played, and I'm just going to play a good old C chord, and take note of this, what is my tenor voice, middle C.
This guy right here.
I'm going to do that. And then I'm going to move to a good old G chord. And now our middle C has moved down to the B right below it. Right? That B wants very, very much to move back up to that C. Right?
It has a push. It's like it's being pulled.
It's like it's being pulled. Yeah, there's a tension there that's only released when it moves back up. So. Right. That is a tendency tone.
So in this case, in the key of C, that B note was, or the seventh.
Yeah,
of the
scale degree 7
was your tendency tone because it wanted to go to C, the tonic.
Yes.
Now, is there another tendency tone we should keep in mind?
The other big one would be scale degree 4, wanting to move downward to scale degree 3. So if I did same thing, and this time let's focus on our soprano note that's playing a G. And I go to a 5/7 chord. It's on that F. This is scale degree 4. And scale degree 4 is going to want really badly to go down to scale degree 3. Right, yeah. So, C major, G7, so those are the two big ones. There are others in certain contexts, yeah. But those are the two big ones that you learn first. It's going to really mess with your texture and really mess with people's heads if you write tendency tones that don't go in the right direction.
Because 7 wants to go to 1 and up to 1, and
Up to
4
1.
wants to go down to 3.
Yeah.
And those are the two main tendency tones.
Yeah, just to give you a quick example, if I did that wrong. See how we missed something? Seems like we tripped over something. Felt, we don't have that, right?
Can we do it one more time and you kind of like single out the notes?
Yeah. So if I do this wrong.
This note right here wanted to go down to this note right here, but instead it went down to this note right here, and that was kind of weird.
That was kind of weird, yeah.
Yeah.
That's kind of weird. A lot of part writing is avoiding stuff that sounds weird, and it's easy for you when you're just like, man, I just want a good grade on my theory homework, why you busting my balls? It's easy to forget that what you're writing might sound weird if you're not avoiding these rules. Yeah.
Well, what was weird about that was it did seem like there was a thinning out in the texture at the end, and you would think that if anything, you would want a nice thick for the very last resolution. That would be a great place to have a thicker texture.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because it's kind of like a glorious dive into an empty pool.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think that sums it up for the melodic line by itself. Now let's get into counterpoint and how these lines can start to work together.
Very good.
Now that I had my pen and I've already written out my first melody, observing all these rules,
Yep.
It's time to get those other 3 voices in there.
Yeah, so let's talk about those other 3 voices.
So a lot of times, this kind of thing will occur on the grand staff, SATB, and you'll see the bass and the tenor in the bass clef.
Right.
Of course, bass stems pointing down, tenor stems pointing up. And in the treble clef, you'll have the alto and soprano.
Right.
The alto stem facing down, the soprano stem facing up.
Right,
so
yeah.
Nice 4-part texture.
Yeah, and again, this is a convention that is very prominent in vocal music. In instrumental music, it's less prominent for various reasons, but in this laboratory-like setting of ours, we're keeping things nice and simple and easily recognizable. So that we always know what voice you're talking about in any given note. If you look at solo piano music written by Schubert, it may or may not conform to that convention, but there will be 4 voices in that music.
All right. Well, okay. when voicing these melodies together and thinking about the chords that result from each place and the melody, we have to kind of talk about good ways to space these things out, and that kind of lead us into, I guess, open and closed structures.
Right, yeah. So an open structure is one when there is a certain amount of space between chord tones. For example, I'm playing a C chord here, but I'm not just playing C, E, G in succession necessarily. So in my left hand, I've got octave Cs. And above that highest C, I'm up to G.
Alto.
Yeah, that's the alto voice. And then my soprano has gone up a sixth from that and is in E. So, yeah, and so this is something that we call a open structure, and this structure will move in similar ways, it'll, versus a closed structure, which tends to be more, in which I have a C in my bass, and then my tenor is E, my alto is the G right above that, and my soprano is the C right above that. So we're just closed position. They're sort of closed together, and right next to each other on the staff.
They're not as, from the lowest note to the highest note, there's a little bit less space.
Right,
okay.
Yeah, so. Typically in open structures, there's more than an octave between the tenor and soprano voices, whereas in a closed structure, there's usually less than an octave between the tenor and soprano voices. So the upper three voices in a closed structure are all fit within an octave of each other. Whereas in an open structure, or an open texture, that's not necessarily true. There can be more than an octave between those three upper voices. The bass is doing its own thing. We can talk about that.
As we do.
Bassists are just like that.
Independent. We need to have a bass player podcast.
We do. How is it that we're both bass players? I don't think either one of us wants to speak for all bass playing because we're bass players, and that's why we haven't done it.
Meanwhile, everybody else is rolling their eyes at us.
Yes.
Well, I think that covers the structure, the open versus closed structure.
Sure.
Okay, let's go ahead and get into some part writing rules. Here's one that seems to be important. Let no part cross above the soprano or below the bass.
Right. Your highest voice is your highest voice. It should, your alto should not be your highest voice. That will make things sound weird and will confuse and will lead to confusing counterpoint, which will not sound good. So your highest voice is your highest voice. Nothing should be higher than the soprano. Nothing should be lower than the bass for the same reason.
And that you don't want the tenor to sing lower than the bass. You don't want the alto to sing higher than the soprano.
Right, yeah, exactly. For one thing, if you're talking about vocal music, altos, they're an alto because they don't sing as high as sopranos, right? That's not their job to sing in the soprano range. And if you're talking about instrumental music, it's just going to make things sound strange.
Confusion within the texture.
Yeah, what it's going to do is open up this huge hole where the alto should have been, right? And you're going to hear that. You're going to hear that in the music.
Mm-hmm. Great. Let's see here. Here's another one. Keep adjacent parts within a perfect eighth of one another.
Right. So the bass does its own thing. The bass, that rule doesn't really apply. There can be more than an octave between the bass and the tenor. That's an exception to that rule. Basses just do their own thing. It's just the way we are. Mm-hmm. But between the tenor and alto, they should never be more than an octave, really. And between alto and soprano, there should never be more than an octave. Because, again, we don't want to open up huge gaping holes in our texture, right? We feel that it sounds much more musical, and it's going to make a lot more musical sense for these things to be within an octave of each other.
And I think that also goes back to just talking about how we don't want to push people beyond their parts, beyond their register.
Right, yeah.
Keep everything within a reasonable register.
Yeah.
You know what time it is, Matt?
What time is it?
It's time to discuss the perils of the parallels and why you have been told you will go to hell if you do this. Well, let's define parallel motion first of all.
Let's do that. So parallel motion is motion when two voices move by the same interval.
In the same direction, correct?
In the same direction, yeah. So if I have two voices, one is on G, for example, and the higher one is on B, and then they both move up to the G moves to A, and the B moves to C sharp. You know, these are two notes that were a third apart. Moving to two notes that are a third apart, that's parallel thirds. Some parallels are great. Parallel thirds are actually beautiful. You can do those all day. Some are not so. So there is a pretty hard and fast rule that goes all the way from the Renaissance into, and all the way through tonal harmony. It says no parallel octaves. So two voices that are an octave apart cannot both move by an octave in the same direction. Don't ever do that.
Okay.
Also, two voices that are a fifth apart cannot move in the same direction and still end up a fifth apart, so don't do that.
There's that Ben-Hur horn sound we were talking about.
Yeah. It almost sounds like you didn't do it right, doesn't it? Do you hear that?
It has an interesting enough sound on its own, but there is something strange about it.
There's something, and remember, a lot of these things, we're not saying necessarily they sound bad. Bad is subjective. A lot of these things are going to sound interesting or unique or compelling. Remember what we're trying to do here is sound like tonal harmony.
Ah, yes.
You know, it sounds interesting. It does not sound like tonal harmony, which is why they use it in Ben-Hur, right? To sort of create an air of the ancient world, ancient civilizations, right? Yeah. You know, before all these rules existed.
Okay, so don't do parallel octaves and parallel fifths. Why?
Why not? Okay, well, remember that we said that a big part of tonal harmony is the relative independence of the melodic lines.
Yeah.
When you play two notes that are an octave apart, there is virtually no independence of those two things. So they exist in a 2-to-1 ratio with each other, frequency-wise. So for every two waves of the high note, you're getting one wave of the low note. So it's just the same thing, right? If these notes move against each other, then they sound like they've become two voices, right? Because they moved in two different directions. So we can perceive them as two different things because of that.
Yep.
If they're moving in the same direction, we just have one voice here, right? You know, there's not enough independence of these two things to say these are two voices. This is just a single voice. So
zero independence, really.
Zero independence,
except
right?
If not for the octave between
right,
them.
Yeah. So if you get your two voices and you're going along just fine, and whatever, you've immediately created a hole because those two voices that you had just collapsed into one voice, and people. That is audible. People hear that and go, huh? What happened?
Something just dropped out.
Something just dropped out. It can sound like somebody missed a note, or something, and people will be judging your performers and they'll get mad at you because really it was your fault, So that's why we don't do that. With the parallel fifths, it's the same problem. Parallel fifths are a 3-to-2 ratio. So for every 3 notes at the high one, you're getting 2 notes of the low one. it's not quite as bad, but still it's bad enough to have the same problem. That if you just are moving along in fifths, it's really just one voice. You know? And again, Ben-Hur moves around in parallel fifths all the time, right? Well, but that's only one voice. You know that in a tonal harmony context, that would be considered a single voice. So you know, he's not moving in parallel fifths. He's just moving one voice around, doubled at the fifth.
So definitely stay away from parallel octaves.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely stay away from parallel fifths.
Yes.
More so the octaves, or just altogether. Stay the hell away from.
Stay away from all of those.
Okay, it doesn't matter.
Both of
even
those.
though the octaves are a little bit more blatant.
Yeah, they're a little bit. I mean, and it goes without saying, right? That parallel unisons just really will send you to hell, right?
There's no.
I mean,
independence.
there's no even defense to that. You really are just riding one voice at that point, right?
Might as well have killed somebody.
Yeah. Yeah. Why don't you just drag Beethoven out of his grave and kill him again?
Is that guy with the gun still rocking around asking people if they know what a parallel octave is? Stay away from him.
Right. So yeah, definitely don't do parallel unisons. Also, don't do parallel octaves. Also, don't do parallel fifths. Those are all bad. And I feel like I should emphasize here. These things are defined as types of motion between voices. You know, now obviously, you know, if you have, you know, your clarinet doubling your flute in an orchestra score, you know, you can't say, oh, parallel unisons and go shoot, you know, Leonard Bernstein or whoever, right? That's a doubling, you know. Those are just two people playing the same voice.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask you about. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if a clarinet and a flute are sharing the same unison line, that's acceptable.
Yeah.
Now, how about if the clarinet is playing one line and the flute is playing an octave above that line? So it is a parallel octave, right?
It is considered a doubling if it is the same voice.
Ah.
So, you know, again, you know, doubled in octaves, you know, the cellos and the basses do that all the time. Play the same line an octave apart so that they, you know, that is a doubling. That is not parallelisms between two voices.
Okay.
Right. Now, if the flute and the clarinet had been playing completely independent of each other, two completely different things, and then at one point they just play the same notes that are an octave apart, you know, then that texture just got obliterated, right? That's the kind of thing we're trying to avoid.
Obliteration of texture.
Obliteration of texture.
Bad
right?
thing.
Bad.
Okay. Now, as I was reading my notes, as I was kind of looking back over this, I found a small handful of questions to ask you now that we've kind of discussed what a parallel fifth and a parallel octave is and why to avoid them. So here we go. You're pretty good at dumbing things down.
I like to think so.
Yeah, and people like myself and maybe some of our listeners can really benefit from that. And here's one example where I'm going to read something to you and I'm going to have you try to explain it to me because this is regarding the idea of an objectionable parallel.
Okay.
Objectionable parallels result when two parts that are separated by a perfect fifth and a perfect eighth by their octave equivalents move to new pitch classes that are separated by the same interval.
Yes.
What? What?
Basically, they're just saying all the things we just said. So when any two parts, and they're using the term parts, I tend to use the term voices, when those two parts are separated by an octave or any octave equivalent, so an octave, 2 octaves, 3 octaves, whatever, and they move in the same direction and land still an octave or 2 octave or 3 octaves apart, that is what they're calling an objectionable parallel. That is a parallel octave. Same goes for fifths. And presumably fifth equivalents, you know, an octave and a fifth, 2 octaves and a fifth, you know.
That sounded way better when you said it. Myself and Matt were kind of raised on the book Tonal Harmony by Stefan Koska and Dorothy Payne.
Yes, and a lot of you are being raised on that book too, albeit a later edition.
But you're teaching from a different book currently, aren't you?
Not currently.
Okay.
Yeah, they still use that at UAB.
But there are definitely places where...
There are definitely other textbooks you could check out.
Yeah.
And I would even, you know, if you want to email or get in touch with us and ask for recommendations, I can even ask for recommendations. Koska Payne is great.
Yeah.
But it never hurts to have, diverging perspectives.
Thank you for clarifying that about objectionable parallels.
You're welcome. I do what I can. Theorists like to talk like that sometimes.
Speaking of clarification, as I was reading through these, as I was kind of getting my notes together for this episode, I actually had a couple of questions to ask regarding parallels.
Throw them at me.
Okay. Now, do these rules apply to the inversions of these intervals?
Well, that's interesting. That's an interesting concept. The inversion of a perfect octave is a perfect unison. Absolutely there, right? Perfect unisons and perfect octaves are both bad.
Yeah.
The inversion of a perfect fifth is a perfect fourth. And perfect fourths, I think I've said this in previous podcasts, every time you start talking about fourth, things start getting complicated. But yeah, there's a sort of complicated... The short answer is no.
Okay.
In modern tonal harmony, perfect fourths are okay. Now, in modal counterpoint, perfect fourths were considered a dissonance, and because of that, you couldn't land on a perfect fourth, and things they were treated very specifically because they were considered a dissonance. And I have had theory professors who, in part writing, said, "I really don't like perfect fourths. If you can't avoid perfect, if you have to write a perfect fourth to avoid perfect fifths or octaves, okay, but I really don't like it." And then some people just don't care. I tend to think perfect fourths are okay because with that inversion, you've messed up those ratios to the point to where you can distinguish, even if they're moving in parallels, you can distinguish them as being two voices. So,
Yeah.
Short answer, perfect fourths are more okay. Let's say they're more okay.
Right,
than
okay.
Perfect fifths or perfect octaves.
Cool. What about unequal fifths? What do you know about that?
So unequal fifths are when you move, for example, not to a perfect fifth. For example, that was movement by parallel fifths, right?
Complete
Bad.
parallel motion.
Yeah. When instead of doing that, you move from a perfect fifth to a diminished fifth. So, yeah. And again, this is something the rules have sort of evolved over the centuries, and over time. Some composers a lot of people think that's okay. The short answer is that is okay. There are times even when you're going to be relying on this little, get out of jail card. But the short answer is that's more okay. There are some people who didn't do it. There are some people who would move from a perfect fifth to a diminished fifth, but not a diminished fifth to a perfect fifth. So there are tiny little rules like that. I personally tend not to care, but then again, I can be a lot more forgiving than some theory teachers.
Mm-hmm.
So ask your theory teacher how he feels about unequal fifths.
Cool. So, but just to kind of sum it up, parallel perfect fifths, not cool. But if you have, say, two lines that are moving in parallel motion that are an augmented fifth apart or maybe a diminished fifth apart, that's a little more acceptable.
Yeah, an augmented fifth is going to be a minor sixth. So, moving in parallel minor sixth is, there's nothing wrong with that.
That's totally cool.
Yeah, moving from a parallel fifth to a diminished fifth is like the perfect fourth. It's more okay than parallel fifths. And like I said, there are going to be times when that little get out of jail free card, when you're in a minor key and you're moving from 2 to 5 or something, that little get out of jail free card is going to come in kind of handy.
Well, that makes perfect sense. So one other thing I was kind of unclear about is what exactly is a hidden fifth or a hidden octave?
Right. So we hear the term hidden fifth or octave, or we may hear the term direct fifth and octave. This is something that can occur between the outer voices when they not when they move, not when they are separated by a fifth. Like this is a third. This is this is C and E. But they kind of land on a a fifth or an octave. So I'll go from this third to this fifth right here, you know. So they both move by a leap in the same direction, and they end up either a fifth or an octave apart. It's also considered bad.
Okay.
You know, so just don't do that. For all the same reasons that parallel fifths and octaves are considered bad, it's the same problem. You know, just sort of it obliterates the texture.
Okay, cool. That was kind of unclear on that. So
Yeah.
good to know. Good to know. Okay, one other question I came up with
Mm-hmm.
that I would like to address.
Okay.
Do these conventions apply more so to vocal music compared to instrumental music?
I don't think so. I feel like, in fact, I know that these conventions apply to instrumental music just as much.
Well, texture is a texture.
Right, texture is texture. Some of them, you know, for example, you know, you'll hear people talk about the range of the bass, you know, and they might be talking just as much about what a bass player can comfortably sing, you know, but the principles here are definitely at work in instrumental music. You know, I personally kind of hate it when students come out feeling like this applies to vocal music only because it doesn't.
Okay.
You know?
That was my big question.
Yeah.
Because we talked about SATB, but
Yeah.
as it turns out, SATB doesn't strictly apply to vocals. It's more 4-part writing with those 4 registers in mind, or the 4.
Yeah. The 4 voices. Yeah. The 4 melodic lines. And again, to reiterate, when you come out of our laboratory setting that is a music theory class and move into real music, a lot of sophisticated stuff happens. You know, you have to have a deep understanding of these rules to understand why they're not being broken, because on the surface they look like they can be defied.
Mm-hmm.
And this kind of bothers students a little bit.
My next question was going to be, does it matter with the different textures? But I think we've already determined that textures don't really matter as much as the fact that a line is doing something. It doesn't matter what texture it is.
Right.
If a line is doing, you got a voice and a bass doing a parallel octave, that's still not cool.
Still not cool. You're talking about what, like, timbre matters, whether, you know, if it's a
timbre,
if it's a cello and a flute, is it still a parallel octave?
Yeah.
The answer is yes.
Okay, yeah. When I said texture, what I really meant timbre, the actual tone color, the sound of an instrument.
The answer is yes. It's still parallel octaves.
Oh, man.
I know.
All right. Scrap that last composition. Well, I think we've actually come to a kind of a stopping point on this new material here.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, you know, when you move out of the laboratory into actual music, it looks often like a lot of these rules can be defied by people we consider to be geniuses.
Yes.
One real good example actually comes to mind. There is a Schubert piece that is an A flat, and I am playing a C, and then I'm up a 6, and I'm playing the A flat, and I'm playing C again. And we haven't even talked about voicing rules, about doubling the third, right? And you know, and he does the this little number right here. Let's see if I can play this correctly. And then. And it sounds like he is parallel octaves all over the place, right?
Right.
But, you know, remember that parallel octaves exist between parts. You know, what he's really done is taken his soprano part and just doubled it an octave below. Because when you play the full texture, there are 4 voices here. Bass, tenor, you know, soprano, and alto. So, and my apologies to any pianist who's ever played this piece. I know I just butchered it, but you get the idea, right?
Right.
Even though one of those happens to be doubled, you know, this is not parallel octaves between 2 voices. You know, if you reduce that texture, you would be hard pressed to find parallel octaves or fifths in that texture.
And if you want to hear about the piano, listen to episode 17.
Yeah, listen to episode 17. That's
Great
a good one. They're all good, but that's also a good one.
Yeah, man. Well, shall we attempt a quick recap?
Yes.
All right, we just kind of buzz through it a little bit here, see what we got here. So we talked about the principles of tonal harmony, mainly consisting of triads and seventh chords and how they're used together.
Mm-hmm.
And there we kind of described a melodic line.
Right, the melodic line. We kind of described that.
Yeah, I guess, and that it needs to be independent.
The melodic line is sort of is independent. All of the voices have a certain amount of plausible independence from each other.
Right, and the fact that they work together is kind of considered counterpoint.
Right, yeah, the working together of those independent lines is counterpoint.
And your ultimate goal is to have good counterpoint.
Your ultimate goal is to have good counterpoint, which translates to good tonal harmony music.
Yeah, and the reason that perfect eighths and perfect fifths are kind of, the parallel perfect fifths are kind of shunned a bit is because what they do is they're kind of sapping the melodies of their independence from one another.
Yeah.
When you're doing that kind of thing. So you might notice a thinning or a dropping out of texture.
Yes.
And that's why we want to avoid these things.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, really, and then we talked about closed and open structure.
Yep.
Closed structure being more...
Yeah, closed structure is when the upper three voices, tenor, alto, and soprano. So, closed structure is when the upper three voices are all within an octave of each other, for example. Right? And then open position just tends to be not that, where they're more than an octave away from each other in some way.
Yeah, so it's a wider texture, reaches a little bit further.
Right, yeah.
Okay. And then some of these little rules we talked about.
Right.
And I guess I could just go ahead and list them.
Yeah.
You don't want to let any parts cross.
No, did we talk about that?
Don't cross the streams.
Yeah, we did, yeah. Don't cross the streams. Your tenor should not go above your alto. Your alto should really not go above your soprano. Your tenor should not go below your bass. Yeah, just don't cross those voices. It confuses the idea of their interdependence and which voice is what.
Right. And I can't remember if we actually said this, but I think we did, but just in case, I'll say it now. Avoid muddy sonorities.
Yeah.
What is a muddy sonority? What is a sonority?
A sonority is the sort of sound and dissonance level in what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
When we think about muddy voice, I mean, we think about like, where everything is really deep down.
Mm-hmm.
Thirds and seconds and things between bass and tenor often create a muddiness. You're going against a scientific principle called the overtone series is what's happening. And you're working against that, which it tends to be octaves, and then get closer together, further up you go. So yeah, don't put a lot of close intervals together in the low range.
And it seems like maybe because of the overtone series, it's a little bit more evident in the lower frequencies because that kind of beating or wavering that occurs, boom, 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 boom,
yeah, right,
is a little bit more noticeable.
Yeah. And again, we're just trying to make this sound like tonal harmony. We're not saying that sounds bad necessarily. I mean, I've got a composition I'm writing right now, and the very first chord is, to make it sound like tonal harmony, you might want to avoid that.
Ooh, what was that chord?
That was an F sharp minor.
Okay, just straight up F sharp minor.
Yep.
Cool.
On top of which I had labeled a B minor, so.
Oh.
Yeah. So.
Can't wait to put that on the front of a podcast. Also, keep adjacent parts within a perfect eighth of one another.
Right. So the tenor and alto should be within an octave, and the alto and soprano should be within an octave of each other. The bass and tenor don't have to do that. The bass can be an octave below everything else and be doing its own thing.
Because they're cool like that. Okay, and then we got into parallel motion and the maelstrom.
Yeah, and the big heavy rule book that you're going to get hit with. Yeah, effectively no parallel octaves, which is two voices that are an octave apart moving in the same direction. no parallel fifths, which is two voices that are a perfect fifth apart, moving in the same direction.
And again, when we say parallel motion, we're talking about two voices moving in the same direction and in the same step with the same intervals, right?
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
No direct or hidden fifths where the bass and soprano are not a perfect fifth or a perfect octave apart, but land in that position. Don't do that.
Mm-hmm.
What am I missing? Those are the basic don'ts.
Unequal fifths.
Unequal fifths are more okay if you're moving to, from a perfect fifth to a diminished fifth. Some composers did not do that, but in general, it wasn't shunned the way parallel fifths are.
Mm-hmm.
Parallel fourths generally considered okay.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe in some circles, not as preferable as some other things, but generally considered okay.
And finally, we talked about how this does not apply strictly to vocal music.
Right, yeah. You may think it applies strictly to vocal music because we use the term soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, but these rules also apply to instrumental music.
And we didn't cover this earlier, but before we close up, I had in my mind a question. What is the difference, if there is a difference, between voice leading and part writing? Are the two terms interchangeable?
They're somewhat interchangeable. Part writing is the act of writing voices that you hopefully employed good voice leading to do. If that clears anything up at all.
Yeah, it's like voice leading is more the rules. Part writing is more the action of composing it.
Yeah, never really thought about it, but yeah, it's kind of this different. Yeah.
Or something.
It's a subtle distinction. You're talking about real similar concepts here.
Something in that neighborhood, right?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's plenty to say about part writing.
Yeah. We might have to do a part 2, actually, because we didn't get talking about voicing rules. Doubling the third, which you shouldn't do. Right? Doubling the leading tone, which you shouldn't do. We didn't talk about other stuff. We did talk about tendency tones, but
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
There's other stuff we could talk about, I think.
Well, I love a good sequel.
Yeah.
So stay tuned for that.
Yeah, and we didn't talk about good voice leading principles either, so yeah.
Maybe we can get into that on the next one then.
I think that would be good.
Before we get out of here, I would love to share something.
Okay.
The bumper music you heard, something I kind of came up with called...
Yes, this was an original Jeremy Burns composition.
I called it I Heart Part Writing.
The world premiere.
Yes. But by the time I was done with it, I didn't heart part writing so much. I heard something in there strange that I knew somewhere there was like a parallel fifth or something strange happening, and I brought Matt in here to listen to it. And give us just kind of your thoughts on what happened with my part writing.
And
we're not going to tell when it happened because we went with the listener to try and see if they
I would actually be interested in other people's thoughts on this because I did not notate it out. Yeah. Right. So there's no notation of this. We're just listening.
Nor did I. We can't analyze it too well.
Right. Yeah. We're pretty much going by our ears at this point. But I think what I discovered was sort of a confluence of some of the things we kind of said were okay, but maybe all sort of happening at once, which made us both kind of go,
what's going on?
Yeah. So yeah, listen for that in that bumper music and see if you can determine what part we're talking about and maybe come up with a good explanation of what's going on. I would genuinely love to hear some ideas.
Some theories we came up with, though, that maybe there might be a hidden fifth in there?
I think there's almost certainly a hidden fifth.
Uh-huh.
I think there's also maybe parallel fourths. Which fourths are... I think I've said this on this podcast somewhere, but fourths are always weird. Anytime you end up talking about 4, it's almost got this mystical ability to screw up something. Whether you're talking about parallel fourths or going to the 4 chord or modulating to the 4, or it's really kind of weird how the 4 can screw stuff up. But I do think I heard maybe parallel fourths, which are
Weird but acceptable.
Weird but acceptable. You know, one of those okay-ish things in modern times. There was a time in music history where parallel fourths fourths were considered a dissonance. Mm-hmm. So you couldn't move in a dissonance in a parallel fashion. That was not right. That's not the way we think of them now. So it's kind of an interesting situation that way. But I think there's also maybe some parallel fourths in there. Tell me what you guys think.
Yeah.
And if you can absolutely find, I grilled Jeremy mercilessly trying to find a clear example of direct or parallel fifths or octaves and didn't immediately find one. Mm-hmm. There still could be some hidden in there. We'll see.
I just sat there with biting my nails, waiting for him, his eyes or his face to make a weird look.
Waiting for me to give him a D- on his part writing.
But I skated through, right?
But he skated through. I'd call that a hearty C+.
So maybe I'm not the next Bach, but it was something worth trying,
Yeah, definitely going to get credit for the part writing though. So
E for effort.
E for effort.
There's one more thing I want to say about this voice leading situation.
Okay.
I thought it would be as simple as writing a melody, and then stacking. That would be my soprano part, and then I would stack a third below it.
Okay.
That would be my alto part. Then I would stack a parallel third above. I guess it would have to be a fourth, depending on where you go. But I was going to try and go down a chord tone per chord tone, and then just follow. As long as there wasn't an octave or a fifth, I would be okay, right?
No.
Yeah.
No, it doesn't really work that way, does it?
No, I learned the hard way.
Yeah, there used to be a thing. Maybe I should look this up before I open my mouth, but screw it. There used to be a thing called faux bourdon.
Ooh.
Which was sort of it was in the Middle Ages and Renaissance in England, and that was kind of what they did. They just did that and sang that way to sort of mimic voice leading in counterpoint. Yeah, no, that doesn't really work.
Yeah, because when I'm singing harmonies with somebody, that's ultimately what I'm doing is stacking thirds and following in parallel motion within the keys given, within the chords given,
Yeah. When you're harmonizing vocals in a band or something, what you're falling back on a lot is the idea that unlike parallel fifths or octaves, parallel thirds are totally okay. So you can sing parallel thirds all day long and not really have to worry about it. But beneath you is not just a stack of thirds. Mm-hmm. That's kind of the musical equivalent of thinking, the earth sits on a giant turtle and it's just turtles all the way down, right? Do you remember that little anecdote? Yeah.
Yes.
It's not that.
I was definitely oversimplifying things in my head, I think.
Yeah, I think you might have been just a little bit there.
Like, how hard can this be?
how hard can this be, right? An anecdote about how hard it can be. Bach learned how to do stuff like this because he lived in a family of musicians, a family of organists, and there was a time when he was considered too young to start to play yet, or too young to start to compose yet.
Huh.
What he would do was he would get up in the middle of the night, steal his father's organ book.
Whoa.
And by candlelight, copy down everything, note for note for note, onto a scratch sheet of paper from his father's organ book, and then stick the organ book back on its shelf and be like, ooh, yeah.
Walk away whistling?
Yeah, walk away whistling, and then he could sneak off and play, the organ. He did that every night.
Wow.
Yeah, hand copying out of an organ book. And that's how he got so good at it,
That's why I'm not as good as Bach. I didn't have that kind of dedication.
So, until you're spending your nights copying by hand organ music.
Well, kudos to you if you do.
Yeah, right. I don't. Disclaimer, I don't spend my nights, I spend my nights sleeping like a normal person.
You're going to find that our podcast, we bake a lot of little cookies like this for you guys.
Yeah, you should listen more often, actually, more carefully to some of this stuff.
Usually our bumper music has something to do with the episode that we do.
Yeah.
Unless it's just like one of Matt's really cool compositions that We haven't even gotten there in theory yet, but it just sounded really cool.
It just
you know?
sounded really good. And I'm like out of those, by the way. I've got to like compose more stuff
I know.
before we get to use more of my. But even then, sometimes, if we're talking about modes, that may be a modal thing. Mm-hmm. There are congruences there too. So check it out.
Well, whatever that thing you showed us earlier with the big F sharp minor with a B minor on top of it. I think it was a B minor on top of it.
It could well have been, yeah.
I can't wait for that one to come out.
Yeah, me either.
Keep on plugging away at that one. Well, anyway, that's all I wanted to say. So go ahead and give this a listen. We're going to go ahead and play it out for you. And I hope you enjoy it. And email us if you can find out where this little spot that I'm talking about is.
Yep, cannot wait.
Thanks for listening. For questions and comments, email us at info@musicstudent101.com. Now go write that 4-part chorale.